The street demonstrations in Brazil over the last 10 days have caught the attention of the entire world. First of all, it was a massive outpouring of public sentiment. Over 1 million people last Thursday in 12 different cities across the country, from the Amazon basin down to the industrial heartland of southeastern Brazil. The demonstrations began as a protest against a significant increase in the cost of public transportation. Actually, by Western or European U.S. standards, not a very significant increase, about 25 U.S. cents. And the protest was led by a movement that has been in existence for several years called the Free Fare Movement, which wants public transportation to be improved and the cost brought down so that even relatively poor Brazilians can afford to ride. Within 2 days after the Free Fare movement had brought out its tens of thousands of protesters in a few cities, they were joined by mainly young, almost entirely peaceful demonstrators. And by a week's end of street demonstrations, the demands, though vague in some respects, had begun to coalesce around three principal issues. First, that the government is spending a great deal of money that should be going to other things to prepare the country to host the World Cup next year and the Olympics 3 years from now. This money, according to the demonstrators, should be spent on things in the country such as hospitals and schools, as well as infrastructure throughout the country. So the wasteful spending on the World Cup is one of the principal things that the demonstrators found objectionable. The second major issue, of course, is the absence of those infrastructures, the transportation, the schools, hospitals. These are, and have been for many years, notoriously inadequate in Brazil, and the country's recent, rather impressive development has not succeeded in making up for these deficits. The third principal complaint by the demonstrators is corruption. And this will be a more difficult thing for the government to attack. How do you deal with deeply embedded corruption that dates far back into the country's history, as it does in several other countries in Latin America? So, how did the government respond? For 2 days, it said absolutely nothing. Then the president, Dilma Rousseff, said that she wanted to hear the voice of the people. And by week's end, made some very general comments about how she agreed with the demonstrators, but that she would not allow violence to occur. In fact, most of the violence was by the police, not by the demonstrators. There were a tiny fraction of the demonstrators who were either ideologically motivated, militants, and violent. Aside from that, the demonstrators were peaceful, their demands heartfelt, but, as I've said, somewhat vague. By the end of this past week, the president had come out to say that she was strongly in support of the goals expressed by the demonstrators, and she put forward a 5-point program designed to satisfy those demands. First, she promised to use all of the state's royalties from the vast new production of petroleum for education. Second, she agreed to import tens of thousands of doctors to make up the deep deficits of medical service, mainly in Brazil's cities. Third, she would commit 25 billion US dollars for the construction of major public transportation projects. Finally, and most impressive, she called upon the people to support a referendum on a constituent assembly to vote on major political changes that would tighten up against corruption, insist on voter accountability, which does not now exist, and provide clearer communication between the voters and the Congress. Now, these are all important measures. The problem is, in the short run, President Rousseff has attempted to put several of these through the Congress in the last year and a half, and her predecessor, Lula, the head of the Workers' Party, or PT, had tried several times to get these measures through Congress without success. That's going to be a problem for the president. By federal or executive order, she can move the royalty funds into education. She can bring in the doctors, but she's going to have trouble getting the funds for the major infrastructure projects that she's promised. How else to relieve the political tension remains to be seen. For the moment, the country is calm. As I've said, the demonstrations are not violent. The president is now responsive. She met just last night with a group of the Free Fair Movement leaders. And it looks as if there will be some open communication between the government, principally the president, Dilma Rousseff, and the leaders of the demonstrations. Of course, one of the problems is that the demonstrators are anomic, diffuse, and essentially without leadership. And that's difficult in a political democracy where political expression of the citizens' wishes tend to be through political parties and through elections. There are very few mechanisms in modern political democracies that allow for the expression of ill-defined, unled, diffuse political demands. Takes us back to one of the fundamental observations by a political scientist, Samuel Huntington, more than 40 years ago, observing the European democracies after World War II, when he said that the aspirations of the people for more service, more freedom, more of everything, economic and political, in a democracy, far exceeded in its pace and dimension the capacity of the new states to satisfy the demands of its citizens. And Huntington said that would always be a problem in modern democracy. Well, as it was for the European countries in Western Europe in the decades after the Second World War, it certainly is today in the newly democratic countries of Latin America and elsewhere in the world. But the final word on Brazil returns to the economy. Quite recently, GIS published a major report by our Brazil expert, Carlos Eduardo Lins da Silva, which I recommend to you. Although it was written and posted before the demonstrations, a few of its essential points should be stated. Brazil is a thriving economy. Its growth rate is slightly lower than in the boom years of last decade, but it's still growing faster than the United States, for example. And it is a country which, compared to its peers in the so-called BRICS, Russia, China, India, South Africa, has the clearest judiciary system. It is a country in which the rule of law actually operates. It is certainly less corrupt than its fellow BRICS. And its regulatory agencies, with which foreign investors would deal in any field, are the best developed, most developed, and the most transparent of all of those BRICS. In other words, compared to its peers, Brazil is a relatively safe place, a relatively easy place to invest and with which to do business. One of the interesting things is that while the red tape is still annoying to many European and US investors, it is applied equally to all parties. There is no discrimination against foreign investors in the application of regulatory red tape. So Brazil is in a good place. Its energy policies are exciting. It has been transformed over the last 10 to 15 years from a country dependent on foreign sources of petroleum and other energy to a net exporter, and its new investments over the last 2 or 3 years promise vast new reserves. It has made major investments in ports, mainly through Indian capital, surprising in a country where infrastructure investment is relatively low. And it has engaged successfully in a wide variety of trade pacts, although under financial pressure has become slightly more protectionist. The point is, economically, Brazil is doing fine. It is a democratic government. It has a responsive, sensitive president. It has a bit of chaos in its Congress, so it's not as active in the legislature as it might be. But then here in the United States, we find that to be a serious problem as well. So my closing comments on Brazil is to have patience. Let's see how Dilma deals with the current difficulties and remain calm with regard to the economic situation in the short and medium term. Thank you.